I'm very grateful to Lisa and Allah for inviting me and giving me the chance to think through what I would consider part of the history of Russia, which involves an oppressive system of a government and some inspiring resistance to it. And I know from friends, some think emphasize more the oppression, and others find some comfort in the lessons and voices of those who resisted, and not entirely intelligentsia either. And I guess I could start with an anecdote, since anecdotes are now in fashion, that I'm reading to our 5.5-year-old, Buratino, a children's story written late in his life by that kisser-upper, you might say, Alexei Tolstoy. And even Alexei Tolstoy, towards the end of his life, could not avoid pushing back against Stalin and this version of Buratino, or the Golden Key sometimes called. It's a Russian version of Pinocchio, if you haven't read it. And there is an English translation available, which is what I'm reading to Jomi, our 5.5-year-old. And it is inspiring, and it's a pushback. And he also wrote some very ironic folk tales, or edited them and published them at the end of his life, that you will wonder how he got away with them if you look at them. I discussed them in my book, Firebird and Fox. So I'm going to talk about 3 topics today. The first is, how does the propagandistic discourse of the Soviet press under Stalin differ from today's fake news? Secondly, I'm considering the question, should we read the Stalinist press as expressive of political culture, performative culture, or both? And the third question is, why did the Soviet press flourish? What factors explain its robustness, despite what appears in retrospect to be easily mockable distortions and absurdities? So let me begin with the first question. How does the propagandist discourse of the Soviet press under Stalin differ from fake news? Here I went to my old friend, the OED. The term for fake news dates from the late 19th century. I mean 19th, not the 21st century. So the OED defines fake news as US news, not surprisingly, US news that conveys or incorporates false, fabricated, or deliberately misleading information, or that is characterized as or accused of doing so. So that nice little definition covers both sides. Either you're making fake news or you're complaining about fake news. This is close to the meaning of fake news today, but if I just give you 2 examples of fake news well before today, 1890, the Milwaukee, Wisconsin Daily Journal. There's a quote in the OED. It shows that placing stories and challenging stories as fake dates from that period. The quote is, that mine story, that is a mine, which you dig, mining is rigorous. That mine story is one of the greatest pieces of fake news that has been sprung on the country for a long time. And the second example from OED illustrates the same thing. It's a challenge to yellow journalism. It presupposes, here, yes, the second example. The quote reads from 1917, Railway and Marine News. Fake news of the most dangerous character is already published in the yellow journals. So fake news is by definition part of a diverse discourse. That's the point I want to make. within a multifaceted journalistic environment. It presupposes an alternative or diverse press, whether you are pushing a story which most people consider crap and false, or you're complaining about other people who are doing it. It presupposes a rival interlocutor of true news. Even under Putin, there's a dialogic aspect of fake news. Now, what about propaganda? We love propaganda, right? How can we not? Propaganda, in contrast, aspires to be monologic, that is, to speak in a single voice. The frustrations of the Stalin press was to try to write something that could only be interpreted in one way. Who led the path to this? The censors of Nicholas I, I think, the ironclad censorship, which said the censor had to try to interpret everything in the worst possible way so nothing would get by. You couldn't beat that, right? So it usually has an unseen, it may have an unseen or unheard opponent, but that opponent is never recognized, never given voice. What did Lenin, who looks less and less friendly as years go on, what did Lenin have to say about propaganda? For Lenin, propaganda has its primary purpose of influencing over the long term beliefs in order to sway behavior. So Lenin and the Bolsheviks distinguished between propaganda, which is aimed at changing beliefs, and agitation that promotes action on a single issue. So it's all in what is to be done, that lovely little piece that we all use in classes sometimes. So why did I pick Zaruvezrum as the image to promote my talk? I picked it because it exemplifies the power and complexity of the Stalinist press. It was designed to help propagandists promote the unchallengeable belief in the superiority of the Stalinist system over life abroad. It helps remind us of the large number of people involved in creating a newspaper world, a world of information. With the circulation in the second half of 1935 of only 125,000 copies, it was not only prestigious, but also informative and even entertaining for its cartoons and photographs. It was more than 20 pages. This was not something you could read on the metro, when the metro was just getting built in that time, or on a bus, right? You needed a place where you could put an actual newspaper. And most people didn't have such a place, even though it's built as a tabloid. And why did they make it a tabloid? Maybe because they thought it'd be easier to carry around and point to an issue when you were agitating the readers. Okay. The tabloid format was accessible, but the length suggested you needed a place to store it. So the cover issue, number 14, on the 15th of May, 1935, exemplifies the paper's appeal to agitators. I had the good fortune, to put in an anecdote, of attending an agitational session given in the Lenin Library just after the Russians invaded Afghanistan. I saw a sign up, a speaker will explain the events taking place in Afghanistan. I went to the room. There were two foreigners in the room, yours truly and an African student who may who got there out of curiosity, and he must have been a good student too to go there. And I wrote down everything I heard and put it in a letter that I sent out home through the diplomatic pouch. We had to mail them open in those days. How long did that letter take to reach the USA? 2.5 months. Everyone wanted to see that letter. And the embassy, the old embassy, invited me to their secret room. I was sworn to secrecy, which was a room on the 3rd floor, which you had to duck a little because there were strips of tinfoil hanging from the ceiling every few inches apart to keep it from being listened to. And I told them, about what the reaction was, as far as I could tell, to the invasion. In any case, the agitator answered questions, and when someone said, how come we shot the people who invited us there soon after we got there? And the agitator, who did not look like a member of the intelligentsia by any means, he looked like he could take you on, actually. He had a physical presence. He pointed at the young person and said, my friend, if you listen to the Temni Volny, you're listening to the voice of your enemies, and I do not advise it. And then someone said, what happens if they resist us? And he said, we'll pound them to dust. And everyone clapped, except for me, because I was busily writing away. So that's agitation. And it reminds you that an information system, even a print culture one, devolves on large numbers of people participating. And I'm going to get to how that relates. Okay, so let's see. So the cover exemplifies the paper's appeal to agitators and propagandists. Not exactly the same. They could read it for enjoyment, use it to explain why Soviet workers and peasants should be happy to live in the Soviet Union and not in America. The front page shows gloomy workers crowding into a narrow entrance to the New York subway. By way of contrast, the Moscow metro had been operating already for 1.5 years, a mobile palace for the people. What was happening in the US in 1935? When these people wrote this. These are Russian correspondents in America. There are several things that are strange about this. First of all, there are no photographs. Photographs were all over the place in the press. Why would you have a front page story with no photograph? Because they couldn't get a photograph that pleased them, or they couldn't get it to Moscow. This wasn't a story that was time-bent. They could have waited a month to get it to Moscow. They could have taken it in the diplomatic pouch, but they found that the fake picture was much more important. And I'll remind you that in 1935, the New Deal was already in full swing. Recovery had begun. Even though if there wasn't a full recovery, and compared with Russia, conditions were hardly as bad as they were in Russia. Okay, so by contrast, all right, so the same issue features a grim piece. You can't see it in that picture, I don't think, by none other than Ilf and Petrov, who were writing from Greece. Were they having a nice time in Greece in May? You bet they were, right? But Greece was a terrible place ruled by horrible fascists, and you would just thank your stars that you weren't there in this piece. They also had a letter from unemployed Poles bewailing how horrible it was to be a Pole in Poland. So the evocation of enemies abroad was also an effective element of Stalinist propaganda. A device it shares with fake news, but unlike fake news, it does not engage with rival information. Did Ilf and Petrov know they were fibbing? You bet they did. Did the journalists who ordered this picture believe they were lying? Of course they had to, right? So let's say now. So we remember that fake news has a contested sphere, whereas propaganda doesn't. So part 2, should we read the Stalinist press as expressive of political culture, performative culture, and here I don't mean theatrical culture, I mean something narrower. Say if, for example, you're a cross-dresser, and you are playing a role, so you would dress the role in the morning, even though you might take it off at another point in the day or something like that. So I think in my book, Thank You, Comrade Stalin, I used that example of cross-dressing. So let's see. I'm glad to see Olga Velikanova here because she is our expert on Russian political culture, and I've drawn much from your work. So bravo, and if you haven't read Olga's work, I urge you to go for it. It's inspiring, and I've been following her work, what, for 30 years, 25 years, right? Okay. Right from a wonderful book on Lenin to a very stimulating recent work, and I will mention them. So the question of political culture, performative culture, or both, is important because it helps us evaluate the foundations of Soviet political practice and belief. One could say, and here I could be corrected, that political culture entails the nuts and bolts of decision-making that shape the life of a nation and require the concurrence of its citizens. Whereas performative culture is for show, attracting a spotlight to highlight allegiance to this or that political decision, to that person in power or the event of the day. Performative culture is active because you look in the mirror and you say, today I'm going to convince my boss that I love the war in Ukraine. Today I will do it. I promise myself. That's performative culture. Every chance I have, I will put a little znachok on my shirt with a Z on it, which I will take off when I get home. I will not show the Ukrainian flag, right? Okay, so Pravda and Izvestia, when we think of political culture, reveal a set of beliefs, meta-narratives, discussion points that can be said to reveal or exemplify Russian political culture, whether in the coverage of life abroad or in portrayals of us and them. Here I mentioned the pioneering work of Olga, which I already tooted the horn. Political culture is not propaganda, but what kind of a hold does it have on the population? There's the question. Let's consider, in contrast, the performative aspect of the Soviet press. On one hand, the newspapers articulate a series of ideas and concepts, including, for example, the Stalin cult and the discussion that Olga recently wrote about the Stalin Constitution, which is very illuminating. In the Soviet press, the leading newspapers, as we might say, as they were called. On the one hand, so including the Stalin cult, presumably those who shared the political culture, not everyone, believed absolutely, not everyone believed absolutely in the Stalin cult. Everyone who shared in the political culture would find confirmation of their feelings and belief in these leading newspapers. So, but you don't have to believe to read Pravda for touching base with the political culture. So the performative culture just shows you another aspect, it seems to me, of the foundational nuts and bolts of a political system. It shows where the non-believers come in. And interestingly, I would say that, let me give an example. Even when you look at Pravda and Izvestia, you don't see the same ideas articulated exactly in the same way throughout the newspaper. What constitutes a good party member? This is an example I gave in Thank You, Comrade Stalin. In Pravda and Izvestia, you find an inspiring discussion of self-sacrifice and so forth. But in the letter or in other columns, you can find a good party member does not beat his wife and does not get drunk, right? Now that's part of political culture, but you don't find it in the editorial so often as you might find it in a different part of the newspaper. So all I'm saying is informational systems are very complicated, and that's worth pointing out. Here we are. So let's say we know, okay, so we know from reader one aspect of the information system that I think is very important to note that relates both to the idea of performative culture and the political culture is the way information is treated as it is produced. We know from the reader studies, and I can confess I read almost every one of them, reader studies in the 1920s, in the beginning, the people who organized the studies for the government were interested in what do people think. So they even asked questions in the first big reader study in 1918 of Red Army soldiers. Do you prefer Pravda or fairy tales? Was one question. And the answers I saw before in the old Soviet terms, they said, you can't see any more of this. We decided to not remount. But the answers I saw on brown wrapping paper, some of them wrote, but Pravda is fairy tales. That was right. It was brown wrapping paper they used for food. So it was very inspiring, but I was only able to see 100. And it was from a baker's unit, which they thought could never tell me anything that would reflect badly on the Soviet system, because who doesn't love Russian bread, right? So in any case, we know from those studies that gradually the bosses lost interest in what people think. And they decided the important thing is how can we boss them around? So it was the shift to the command economy. And the classic line in these days is, I would think would, if those damn peasants can't to understand how to farm scientifically, we'll have to force them to do so. Command them to sign. Well, why didn't the peasants farm scientifically during the net? Why did they try to get rich from clover? Because they were not, because they knew if they started to get rich, they'd be punished, right? They'd be terrorized. They'd be kicked out of the Soviet. Everything bad would happen. So they didn't listen, of course, and rightly so. But eventually the regime figured out a way to make them listen, terrify them. Okay, and the view of America and how this system worked is worth mentioning, is that they were constantly telling readers that America was a lousy place, as in this article from Zaruvezrum. But they gradually realized that people didn't believe them. They couldn't convince the readers. They would basically frame articles such as, say, like, you think America's a great place, but what about lynching? What about the fact America's a hell for Negroes and so forth? So they had that kind of article. I know one of the high school students I interviewed asked me, how did the Russians react to the persecutions in America of left-wing people during the McCarthy years? And my answer was, well, if they had reported that people were losing their jobs and being forced to testify in Congress because they were suspected of being communists, people would want to move to America. Why aren't they shooting these people the way we are? Why don't they send them to a gulag or something? So that was why there was no coverage of the persecution of the McCarthy stuff in the press. I never encountered it. I read thousands of copies of Pravda Izvestia when I was doing that particular book. So in any case, so did the system work? Well, when emigres came to America, they were interviewed, and what would they say? Holy crap, there really is poverty and persecution here, right? And racism too. They were astounded. So what the effect of the press was is hard to decipher. So, okay, then I'm going to, so I would, to finish up this section, I would say, did the critical newspaper reading public and the subversive aesthetic culture I describe in my Firebird, the Firebird and the Fox, undermine the official propaganda of the Lenin-Stalinist era? And if so, what is its legacy today? And I would say it did undermine. The answer is yes, in a very real way. The official propaganda and its legacy survives as an inspiration to resist tyranny. And how do we see that? The legacy of the print culture of pre-revolutionary satire and caricature survived in the early Bolshevik years. That meant there was a critical reading public. When Kornei Chukovsky read aloud to large audiences his Crocodile, he was engaging with a public that was looking for irony, intentional or unintentional irony. And the Soviet Union was laden with unintentional Soviet irony. I remember once in the Brezhnev years, some friends gave me a book about the protocols of Zion and how the world was practically ruled by anti-Soviet Jews. An interesting book. Yes, everyone was reading it aloud and laughing about it at that time. So this is what those idiots really believe, right? So they gave me this book. I read some of it, and then one night, drinking too much vodka, I left it on the metro, where it probably fell into the hands of someone who actually believed this. So it's complicated. Okay, so first I point to the satirical magazines of the 1920s. Has anyone read those satirical magazines of the 1920s? They're right out of 1905-7, despite their one-sidedness. Someone like Bulgakov, there was one image in those satirical magazines of irony that I discuss in Firebird and Fox, of the Stalin is pictured as a radio tower broadcasting communism. But it looks like sort of Stalin is blotting out the Statue of Liberty in a sense. Was this ironic? Lenin, the tower of fake news or Bolshevik propaganda or something? It was actually very funny. It's rivaling the Eiffel Tower in this funny picture stuck on the globe. It's a lark, and Bulgakov had a little skit in there about friends having a seance, and the friends in the seance want to know, when will Bolshevism fall, right? Then they hear a knock on the door. Who can it be? Could it be Napoleon? And they open the door. Chekhov, your papers, right? And they send them off. But it's ironic. It's pointing out that people are being terrified by the Chekhov and so forth in the form of a joke. So all I'm saying is there were large numbers of wonderful satirical magazines that even though they were one-sided, they point readers to an opposing reality and an ironic response to official propaganda, official publication. Second, I note the proclamation of socialist realism, which also undermined. How many pictures of Chekhov and others, and making fun of Soviet writers and saying they weren't following, they weren't bossing. Of course, as one art historian wrote, I forget his name, the writers watered the tree of socialist realism themselves. Surely they did, because they had to cooperate. Otherwise, their lives were ruined, most of them. There was no way out. But it contrasted the officially exaggeratedly positive view of Soviet life with the depression and poverty in the West, but it also brought the subversive aspects of the great tradition to the fore in Russian thinking, whether it's Tolstoy or Pushkin and so forth. They didn't go for Dostoevsky in those days, whose cult of Dostoevsky is the Putin era phenomenon. Okay, so let's see. All right, for a third, let me see where we're going on time. Okay, we're in good shape. All right, let me catch my breath a little. So references to the great tradition are unavoidable. One of my favorite, I guess thinking an article, cartoons from the social period, the Pravda devoted 2 weeks to the Writers' Congress in 34, was a cartoon showing pictures on the wall of great writers and a bunch of contemporary writers looking very pokey on the ground, and the pictures of the great writers are looking down on them. And I forget, there was a woman writer, I think she was the one who did, who was Armenian, who wrote the mock-ups of Western, the Yankee in St. Petersburg. Who was that?
Marietta Shaginian.
Shekenya. Yeah, I think she's shown there looking cumbersome and carrying her own portrait. And I think it's Tolstoy leans out and says, it's not time for you to put up your own portraits. Don't put up your portraits, comrades. She says, the line for portraits forms in that room. There's a bureaucrat sitting there. Pretty cool, right? Okay, so that was ironic. Who could not laugh at that weird bossiness, right? So the socialist realist stuff was, okay. And now for part 3, here I'm revisiting an essay that I published a year ago, I guess, in this compendium, which if you put my picture on, I can hold it up. But I should have to be on as speaker. For some reason, I'm not. I should come on the main screen, right? Can you see it if I hold it up? Yes? Okay, because I'm looking at Olga, which is nice, but okay. Well, you can see this. My essay is in the 3rd volume. It's about propaganda and the Soviet press. It's revisiting the Soviet press. And I talk about the visual culture of the 20s and 30s, and right from 1918. But I'm rethinking it in this lecture and drawing on it. The Stalinist press did not emerge full bloom from its Leninist cartoon. It took shape in 4 phases. The first phase from 1918 to 21 is the demise of the old press and the delay in establishing a new visual culture in the absence of an effective language of communication to replace the pre-revolutionary language of popular print culture. The pre-revolutionary language of popular print culture was a marvel. It was simple, it was effective. Ordinary people could read stories in it and newspapers, some of them. So the Bolsheviks decided they were going to replace it with a new language full of acronyms. There's a wonderful late Soviet dictionary of acronyms. You know, worker correspondence, they were writing in Send me a dictionary. How can I understand this? What does this acronym mean? So the acronyms were all over the place and all sorts of foreign words that nobody knew. So the absence of that, and what I would call, how important was this break when many ordinary people, most, were deprived of the language, of print culture. There was an absolute absence. Even educated people were deprived of print culture. Writers had to go out and talk, give talks to make a living. There was no earning money publishing anything because there was no print. All the presses were used for printing Propagandist, which very few people could read, and some of those who could read did not want to read. Okay, so that's the first period. The second period is 1922 to 27. That's the new economic policy. I'm going to close the door because our 5.5-year-old has come back from playground. Okay, that's all. And I won't disturb them with my.
I'll do a quick screen share while Jeff is there, just so everyone can see the cover page for the Zaruvezrum. And this is what Jeff was talking about. This is because they didn't run a photograph. This is the drawing that they ran instead, showing a bunch of people huddled together. And yeah, it's very telling that
it's very interesting. Why couldn't they find a picture like this? They had another drawing on the second page of people sitting on it looks like a mine shaft, for heaven's sakes, right? Rather than a subway entrance. The subway was pretty classy, actually, I think. Okay, so in this second period, the press served, this is the discovery I had. The press served as a means to advance the personnel policies of the growing Soviet state apparatus. This is not the propagandist phase yet. The press served to identify and mobilize cadres, served to rally people to staff the administrative structures and lower level party management, and offered supporters upward mobility and material benefits, as well as, in many cases, party membership. This is one of the key foundations of the Soviet press. And if we think of the current situation in fake news, this is not something that the Putin administration can replicate. And I'll talk about that at the end. Okay, the third, so this was extremely important in the foundation of the Soviet press. The third phase is 1928 to 32. This is a tilt towards propaganda. By the end of 28, the key positions in the administrative hierarchy had been filled by people who had largely demonstrated at least a rudimentary knowledge of political terms and conditions. That is, and they called it political literacy. And there is the political culture in many respects, based on political literacy. These people have access to the political culture. They know it is like proper dressing. You can't go to work in your pajamas, right? You had to go to work dressed in this knowledge of political literacy. And however people thought of it, I remember letters from people, I want to join the Leninist family, however, whatever metaphors. So they had an eagerness to achieve the recognition and emoluments associated with public service. So Stalin reoriented the press towards propaganda as he consolidated power and undermined the net. It was one extensive course in advocacy for joining the administrative bureaucracy of the Soviet Union. So at this point, the left opposition of Trotsky and the others is crushed at the 15th Party Congress in December 27. The Bolsheviks, Stalin group launched the first 5-year plan, collectivization, the persecution and slaughter of prosperous peasants and would-be kulaks, with a sharp turn to propaganda in the press. This is the point at which they stopped arguing and trying to convince people. They just told them, this is it. So the shift can be attributed to opportunity and necessity. The opportunity grew with the enormous growth of the base of supporters as the purges swept away old party members and cleared the way for new ones. What a great country to live in if you know that you don't have trouble getting a job because all the people who have the job you want are likely to be kicked out and imprisoned. And that was true in the Academy of Sciences, right down to other desirable positions. The numbers who are purged are phenomenal. So, and secondly, the necessity of the shift to propaganda followed from the disastrous results of Stalin's Great Break. Living standards fell, workers' wages sank to nearly half of the 1928 levels. Rationing was imposed in cities and millions starved in the famine in Ukraine and Volga region. The press instilled the dual belief that the current calamity was due to domestic and foreign wreckers, and the future held hope for propaganda. For the future held hope for for a better life. So the press adopted as its chief function the task of molding the opinions of ordinary citizens, both with reference to enthusiastic achievers as model citizens and with the comparison of life at home and abroad. And journalists then became propagandists at work. So until the modest recovery of 32-33 from Stalin's Great Break, the press had much to demand and little to celebrate. The recovery coincided with the decline of the Western economies into the Great Depression, but which Russia was still doing worse given the Stalinist repression and all the rest of it and famine than life in America, which was tougher by far than it had used to be. So Soviet workers really enjoy, and peasants enjoyed, an overstated improvement in material life. Reality, this served propaganda and helped dispel the positive images of life in America that had dominated the popular imagination during the 20s. So in socialist realism goes with propaganda. It's the officially, style for literature and the arts. And the emphasis on how bad life was and how evil the West was naturally a big part of the Writers' Congress. So let's see, with it existing. So let's see. So, okay. So why did it hold together? That's a good question. How did this hold together? Well, one reason was the Russians had a long-standing faith in print culture. How long did print culture last? Until Gorbachev departed from a speech that was printed in Pravda. I remember it. Actually, and I was there when under Gorbachev. And what did people say to remind us that political culture still exists? Well, anyone who was there knows that time that ordinary people tended to ask one question when they look at you. And this question was asked to me by someone who was cutting my hair. So it was very risky for me to give my exasperated answer. Is life better here or there? That question was repeated over and over again. And I looked at this solid and strong lady who was cutting my hair. And I said, actually, it's better over there. Right. I was so fed up with the question. I was naive. And what did she say? What was her answer? Can anyone guess? But you didn't fight the war. That was her answer. The war remained the reference point. I felt like I was speaking with a whole nation there. And then the Brezhnev people used to do shows on TV to emphasize how they were the greatest generation on earth and the war generation. And I still remember the stacks higher than a short person like me in the bookstores of Brezhnev's book that no one would buy, but all the schools and libraries and everyone had to buy the book, of course, about his wonderful feats in the war. In any case, the question and the answer were part of political culture, and it's no accident that the Putin people have focused again and again on the war. And I would say Nikolai Koposov, a dear friend of mine, has written a wonderful book about the legal strategies to control history throughout Europe, not only Russia. It's a fabulous book published by Cambridge. I highly recommend it to you. It's not just about Russia, but it deals with France as well. So let's say, okay, so one reason was faith in the printed word. And when Gorbachev departed from his speech, everyone was, in the circles that I moved, everyone was talking about it. He didn't say what was in Pravda. He said something else. And how are people going to reference that piece? How are they going to be sure to quote him and so forth? It produced some discomfort too, but the solidity of print, I know when I was writing When Russia Read, there are all sorts of wonderful proverbs about the power of print. What is written with a pen cannot be hauled away by an ox. Only Russia would, because of the scripture and in the vernacular and so forth. The faith in print culture was very strong. And a second reason why it held together was the very nature of a propaganda system. The terror, the purges, the control over rival sources of information. That was also a way in which they could hold on, the claim that there was only that. But of course, the Temny Volny were to the dark waves from Radio Freedom and there was Nemetskaya Svoboda, and there were a bunch of others still got through. So people who listened, and Stalin had made the mistake of after World War II of producing thousands and thousands of shortwave radios and distributing them throughout the country. So the next time they were invaded, they'd be able to communicate with each other better. But instead, people were listening to BBC on these very radios that had been seeded throughout the country. So, but it did still hold together. So with its existence assured, I return to the question of liars and performers versus the notion of core beliefs. It was a combination, but as in the case of promotion of a picture of the world abroad, it was successful with some, but not others. The reports of Soviet soldiers being shocked by the prosperity of Eastern Europe and Germany tell one story, and the studies of Soviet emigres who came to America tells another. So in conclusion, what can I say from my Firebird and Fox? I wrote it under the Putin regime. My last chapter is called Goodness Endures, because I stress the diversity of Russian culture. If you want to hear people, maybe they're not successful politically, maybe they've escaped the political culture, and it's a complex political culture. But if you want to hear read people who sing about freedom and the evil of oppression, the Russians are pretty good at it. And they've had the experience to do so, even if it seems sometimes that the cards are dealt and every time they come up with the same hand and play it the same way, but that's not exactly true always. So the propagandist constraints of the Stalinist culture were definitely part of the cultural ecosystem, the term I use in my Firebird and Fox, over decades of Soviet rule, and in many respects a dominant part. But they were tempered and bounded by other elements, including the paradoxical ability of unsophisticated readers to read for multiple meanings. Cultural actors continued to have messages counter to narrow official lines, and readers and viewers continued to pick them up. And in this aspect of Russian culture, this gives me some degree of optimism for hope in the present period. Although the instruments of control and the political culture, we might say, are in the hands of the state, are now at least as strong as in the earlier period. The tradition of coexisting, of credulity coexisting with skepticism remains. And here I'd like to mention the work of Dina Hapayeva, another dear friend of mine, who writes about neo-medievalism in Russian culture. And the problem of agency, the current fascination with the denial of agency to ordinary people. And of course, in the Soviet period, the issue of agency was fundamental to the struggle for freedom, whether it was people who were members of the free professions, including journalists, or it was and writers and doctors and engineers. Just to give one example, engineers in the Stalin period were raised in the tradition of free professions. That is, who decides whether a building is stable or not? Engineers. Who decides what the temperature is when you can pour concrete? Engineers. But I happen to live in a building, which I think this was, can't remember whether, no, this was a building owned by the Union of Architects. And that was during the Olympics and the invasion of Afghanistan. I moved in there with some stagiaire who was an architect. He had 7 rooms. So my wife and I could move in there. And he asked me one day, do you ever wonder why at the strange color of this building and that little crack that you can see from the outside? That's because it was poured when it was too cold to pour concrete. And why did that happen? It happened to the Lenin library, for heaven's sake. Why did that happen? Because the Stalinist people ordered, you say, you're listening to the voice of your enemies if you say it's too cold to pour concrete today. So the undermining of the free professions and the struggle for free professions is also linked up with this. Okay, so I want to say just, in my view, the more Stalin-like, and Dina Hapayeva is showing how the Putin version of Stalin-like denial of agency. So in the denial of agency, to give you an example from Stalin, you are parents, your child becomes a prize-winning flyer and breaks the record. You were instructed then to write a letter. Thank you, Comrade Stalin, for raising my child to be a hero. Who raised Comrade Stalin? That's another question. Who raised the hero? You or Comrade Stalin? They never even met Comrade Stalin, for heaven's sake. So that theft of agency goes way back in Russian culture. Okay, so in my view, the more fragile, the more Stalinist the system is, the more fragile in terms of the complex performance of fake news that we see today in the Putin era. Putin does not have the tools that Stalin had. He didn't have the gap in information that Stalin was able to use when ordinary people and most nobody else could read anything in print. He didn't have the party to purge and purge and purge again. He doesn't have the administrative structures and party memberships to issue to people who are being rewarded and being brought up to be loyal and replace the others. And he doesn't have the isolation and autarkic economy that Stalin had. And so the whole complex of thousands and thousands of people who are producing news, many of them, like the journalists who commanded that mineshaft picture of the subway in America, are consciously lying. And the problem of building such a system on conscious liars is complex. How long can it last? Nobody knows, and we don't know what will happen tomorrow, unfortunately or fortunately. As Tolstoy would like to say, all you can deal with is your decisions from today. And that wraps up my talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Let me.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, guys. It was really fun to be able to talk to you, and I feel sort of like family here, that I could just run on and tell an anecdote here and feel comfortable and so forth. And I'm glad it's recorded. So if anyone wants to listen to it and they can't frighten me by appearing as faces I'm not familiar with in large numbers, I won't be sidelined. I'll be a bystander. Thanks. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you have to the best of my ability. Some of you, like Olga, know more about political culture and the background. The one thing I was never able to do in my studies was to see how things were produced. I didn't get very much archive. I told you I had some interesting archives when I wrote When Russia Learned to Read, because they thought, oh, for heaven's sake, he's picked a topic that no one's interested in, all about this crappy popular literature, and he'll never find anything bad about our system by studying this. So go ahead. And some kind librarian actually buttonholed me when I was teaching at University of Chicago, and I had a card that I handed out. I was a young professor. And he said, if you want to read these popular stories, just ask for these yashiki. And suddenly I had thousands of these stories in the yashiki. Of course, they were being stolen, some of them, and sold. They were so rare that I once came back, and this is for Felix, and someone was reading Gazeta Kopeka on my desk and copying it out as a birthday present for a friend. Literally, the librarians would all be reading my stuff when I came in. I had to cut the pages of these copies. That was the Lubochnaya Literatura, but also newspapers I mostly read in the Academy of Sciences, which cafeteria was notable for its bent and unwashed aluminum forks, as I recall. Those were the Soviet times. Okay, so questions?
Just as a explainer, the Gazeta Kopeka was a penny newspaper from the turn of the 20th century.
So, yes, the early 20th century.
Yes, pre-revolutionary and
Felix,
very interesting.
Right, and Felix was explaining the extent of this Kopek network. I was actually astounded to discover them, wrote about them in Russian, When Russia Learned to Read, and also read with fascination the separately printed versions of the bandit stories that were serialized in Gazeta Kopeka. Of course, I also read them. My favorite of all those things was not in Gazeta, though, it was in Moskovsky Listok, The Adventures of Razboynik Churkin, a big favorite of Chekhov. It was like Chekhov's favorite movie night. Every Saturday, he waited to read the bulletin of the latest adventures of Razboynik Churkin, and that was lasted, I think, 3.5 years in Moskovsky Listok, and was published in a partly misprinted version of 1,300 pages independent. So there you have it.